Great, thank you, Janine. As Janine indicated, I think a lot of the themes and issues that were discussed in the previous panel will be fleshed out a little bit more in this session, and I think there will certainly be a lot of ideas that are similar to what were brought up previously. Just very briefly, some information on the trajectory of AIP publishing in terms of our platform. When we originally launched our platform, which is called Citation, we built it in-house. We had a full team of developers and technologists in-house. We hosted and we developed the platform entirely. And then around 5 years ago, we did what John Sack sort of mentioned in the previous session, is that we did this start over calculation, and we came to the conclusion that we really, it didn't make sense for us at the time to be in the software development business, and we transitioned our platform to a SaaS vendor, one of the vendors in this space. So, the new Citation launched a couple of years ago, so we've sort of seen it from both sides. And I think, in my session also, one of the things I want to say that, and I think that this was sort of indicative of the previous session as well, in that, there are as many questions in some cases as there are answers, and there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all scenario for all of the publishers in our space. But, some of the questions that I think come to mind is, what does it really mean to be a platform these days when organizations like the New York Times are posting most, if not all, of their content on Facebook? Why do publishers all have their own platforms? Is our legacy holding us back? Are we not really serving our customers or our users in the way that we should? And why do we support, in some cases, so many unique systems? Peer review systems, fulfillment systems, content delivery systems, production systems. There's just really so much out there. So, one of the things in the STM publishing industry that we've been thinking about is that things really do seem to be shifting. In the past, I think many of us thought as content as being king. And, new conditions support a disruption of traditional models and a circumvention of the monolithic publishers, and it would truly begin to shift from print to digital. And one of the things that my boss, who's in the audience today, likes to talk about is the new sort of GAFA generation, the Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, sort of community that we're living in now. How do we as publishers really reflect and speak to scientists in their earlier career, and who rely more on social media and mobile than laptops? We recently did a researcher survey at AIP Publishing, and even in the physical sciences, where the uptake of mobile has been a little bit slower than in some industries, we certainly see a shift trending more towards that. And again, sort of in this scenario, content is king, or content is kingmaker. The user is king, and overall data is paramount. And we're sort of very much moving away these days from the sort of scenario where users come into a site and grab a PDF and get out, this sort of grab and go methodology. And we feel like publishers really need to engage more fully in the user experience and put the researcher at the center of everything that we do. Sort of as suggested in the previous session, publishers in our space have been putting content online for 20 years, and so in some ways you could think that we're sort of pioneers of this. But, we still largely, in many ways, operate in a print-centric world, and it's sort of very PDF-focused. So towards that, towards that end, and to facilitate the transition, we really need to understand more about our users, and there's sort of various roles that researchers and authors, et cetera, take. And we really need to begin to understand more about our users. We know that there's an ongoing shift in who pays for publishing services, with open access, et cetera. And a recent Copyright Clearance Center webinar in July 2015 called OA Which Direction reported on the continued growth of OA mandates and projected a 15% annual growth industry-wide in OA revenue. To begin to prepare even more for that shift, we really need to get closer to our users and to begin to adapt the services that we provide to them. At the moment, we know that few users really create accounts. There's no real incentive to do that. User profiles are often quite sparse. Platforms don't and can't really track user behavior. Many publishers, AIP Publishing included, are really beginning to focus on data in a way that we haven't really done in the past, and to begin to think about this concept of sort of creating a golden user record where we understand the data that we have about our users, where we go through a process of cleaning, integrating, and organizing our data, and then putting governance rules around that data so that we can begin to create a single, accurate, and current record for all users across our systems, and then to put controls around how users input data into systems so that it stays clean. Right now, users are pretty anonymous and linked mostly through cross-ref DOIs. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And the other thing that I think was touched on a little bit in the previous session is, for the most part, researchers don't really know who we are. They don't know, in the case of AIP Publishing, necessarily what citation is. They just want the content, and they want what they want, but they don't necessarily identify with the brand that is citation. I mean, librarians might, but users really don't. So it's something that I think we need to think about. And again, we really need to increase the amount of usability testing that we do and prototyping. So we've begun to do a lot more in the area of proof of concepts. Test new possible products and services often, change and then retest. So it's something that, as an organization, we've been focusing on a lot more strategically over the past year and a half or so. So again, in the world where the end user is king, publishers and platforms really need to support science and scientists beyond just serving up content. And we've gone through, working with a partner organization, a contextual inquiry process where we've begun to really get much closer to researchers and users in a way that we hadn't really done before. So we did this process last summer, I believe, where we really talked to a unique set of users in a quite detailed way about what their experiences are, what their needs are, what their pain points are, not as it related specifically to our content, but just in general, when they were looking at their workflow beyond just content. What are their pain points? And what can publishers do to really make the experience that researchers have on platforms much more useful and much better, looking at things like research tools to address needs like help me make my article look more professional. Enable me to better capture and record my data. How can publishers begin to think about creating tools that facilitate that sort of thing? What are the sort of things that they come up against in their entire workflow? And some of the things that, again, we talked a little bit about earlier is, I think, collaboration. Researchers often struggle with effective ways to collaborate with their colleagues and to also, determine what the next generation for their research might take. So I think, we're really beginning to have these discussions with researchers about what we can do as publishers to facilitate their entire workflow. Platforms really need to begin to facilitate, and make themselves much more beneficial both for publishers and for researchers. So to begin to, increase the total number of unique visitors using the platform and really increase user engagement to make the products and services on the platform much more beneficial to the scientific community overall, and to really begin to design products and services around researchers' needs, and to provide an easy and intuitive means of discovering digital content, but then also, again, providing workflow tools and added functionality that meet and address their research needs and their pain points. And you know, some of the things that are sort of high level that we've been thinking about and looking at in terms of ways to increase user engagement is to provide additional incentive, things like, you know, looking at the possibility of off-campus access, indexing more content on the platform. Right now, we really only host AIP publishing content on the platform, but, you know, to think about ways to collaborate. You know, we publish content in the physical sciences, so there are, you know, other repositories like Archive. What additional work might we be able to do with them? So, you know, there are new and additional things that, you know, we want to explore in terms of increasing the value of our platform. So we need to think about how to engage beyond the current grab-and-go methodology and help researchers perform tasks across their entire research workflow. And this workflow, and I think, you know, many different publishers have workflow diagrams that are very similar to this. And, you know, this is our attempt to really address and understand and begin to think about, you know, the entire researcher workflow beyond just publishing. And, you know, as we, again, begin to really get closer to our users. So, you know, this is sort of things that we've been looking at. So to sort of, you know, segue away, a little bit away from, you know, the value add that we've been looking at, and to transition into the buy or build discussion, you know, and as we're beginning to think about shifting our thinking and vision around flat platforms, how do we get there? And there isn't a one-size-fits-all sort of scenario. And I think, again, some of these themes were very much brought up in the previous session around, you know, really thinking about what the best situation for you as a publisher might be, whether it's to, you know, build a new platform either via in-house capabilities or with a development house, or, you know, to go with a SaaS vendor. But I mean, some of the things, you know, throughout the trajectory of AIPs, you know, thinking about this, some of the main things that we've been thinking about with the overall themes of making sure that our platform is very customer-centric, focusing on the user, and beginning more and more to think about, you know, an agile methodology, which is, you know, somewhat newer, at least to our organization. But some of the things that we want to ensure that we have for our technology partner is, you know, to someone who's really, you know, a forward thinking and future-proofing. Help us to prepare, an organization that can help us to prepare for the emergent and future needs of researchers. Someone who, you know, can address the current needs of a platform with our institutional markets, but then will also be able to transition into a future world with us. Someone who's also a close cultural fit for our organization, and who is, you know, we don't like to think of the organizations that we work with as partners. As vendors, we very much like, you know, to work with organizations in a real partnership, and they need to be a good cultural fit for us as an organization. So, you know, as we think about these things, you know, and I think James talked a little bit about this in the earlier session, is, you know, it is sometimes hard to attract certain staff to publishing, particularly in the area of technology. You know, we are in the New York area, so there's a lot of competition for really good talent. And it's more than just development staff. It's, you know, all of the different capabilities and expertise that need to really support a strong technological programs. So, some of the areas that we've been looking at in terms of either new or improving, sort of areas of expertise is, around development, around data architecture and data scientists, around product management. So we've had product management in the past, but we've shifted that to become a much more strategic role within the organization. Web design, user testing. We have people who are now in-house focusing specifically on usability testing, which is something pretty new for us. So there's a shift happening. Within some publishing organizations to really look at the capabilities that you need in-house to support, platforms and technology overall. So, in terms of a buy or build, and again, when you're talking about building, there are different ways to do that. There are companies out there that build for you, or you can do it in-house yourselves. And there are examples of these scenarios that have been successful for both. And I think, again, some of the things that you really need to consider is, is the platform partner that you're going to go with, can they manage, and are they appropriate and suitable for the business today? And will they be appropriate and suitable for the business into the future? Again, there is not a one-size-fits-all scenario, and you really need to review the capabilities on both sides and see whether it's a good and right fit. So when you begin to think about the pros and cons for a buy versus a build scenario, there's a lot of things to consider, and I think that this space is shifting to some extent. And again, I think that this was, pretty well discussed in the previous session, but, some of the benefits to owning a platform, developing, either in-house or with a partner, is that you do have much more control and flexibility over the product roadmap and over the customer journey. You own the intellectual property in that scenario, where you may not in a SaaS scenario. I think another one of the things that that someone said in the previous session is, it's sort of nuts to build these days when there are a lot of strong solutions out there already, but you really need to think about what you want, and it's shifting. This is another area that is really shifting, and I think John Sack talked about that a little bit in the previous session, is that some of the SaaS vendors in this space are giving publishers, at least on the front end, much more flexibility than they've necessarily had in the past. So this concept of a plugin allows customers to have more flexibility and more control in the SaaS scenario than we've seen in the past. So there's a lot to consider, and I think you really do need to look at where your organization is and what the options are and what your capabilities are, and some of the things that you need to consider. It is a big decision. Building a platform from scratch will tend to be a lot more expensive and take a lot more time. One of the concepts that was discussed a little bit at the previous session was this concept of a first-generation platform, where publishers felt like they didn't have much of a choice. But that's changing now. There's a lot more. There are a lot more scenarios. We have seen publishers build using development houses. I mean, we know that JSTOR just launched a new platform recently, transitioning away from a SaaS scenario into a scenario where they worked with a development house to build. We see companies like Ixis who are building end-to-end scenarios. So there's a lot. Things are really changing, and it's not necessarily a completely either-or type of decision. There are different options. So there's a lot to consider in this space. But I think it's an interesting time, and it's a really good time. So in closing, publishers should be considering how to make the transition to, focusing on end users, designed, so that platforms are designed around the central tenet of helping to more fully fulfill researchers' needs by providing a technological means of discovering and delivering digital content, as well as workflow tools and added functionality to researchers that really helps address their needs and makes platforms more valuable for both end users and for the publishers. So there are many different options to consider to satisfy this need. It's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all for all organizations. So thank you.